The Jetsons, 1963, issue 19. There's a page where George's alarm clock goes off and his bed gets leaned upright with robot hands pulling down his blankets, and he calls out for his wife, telling her to turn off the wake her upper because it doesn't know it's Saturday. They must have forgotten to tell the day before that it would be Saturday. They shouldn't have to do that. You'd think it'd know what day it is. There must have been a blackout to screw up its sense of days of the week. While George is at a drive-in theater with his family, he tells them what they must have already seen on screen for some reason. They're watching a movie based on real history, and we're supposed to believe that if one single battle against the Native Americans was lost to them, their country would have been ruled by them. This would only be believable if they live in a universe where most of them weren't wiped out by disease by the time the Americas were discovered, because then they'd have the advantage of outnumbering the Europeans. But even then, there could always be more battles. They wouldn't have given up. Not to mention it's cringeworthy that they're being called what they are in these panels. In the future, Elroy says one little bee changed the course of history because it caused the general's bugle to blow early to make his soldiers charge. It makes no sense, but it's always better to establish history to make a world feel real, even though the history is boring. Judy reminds George that a similar thing happened in ultra-modern times. Sir Fred, the space explorer, went a million miles off course to dodge a meteor, which would only make sense if the meteor was taken over to start following him like it became a heat-seeking missile, because all he'd have to do is steer to the left for a couple of seconds, and then go back to driving towards his destination for his spaceship to no longer be in its path. And the way that it's drawn makes no sense. The spaceship goes up a little bit, for no reason, considering that it goes right back down, and it didn't crash into the floating pebble, so clearly it's a giant rock way out in the distance from it. Why did it go up and down? This can't be showcasing how he veered way off course, because either way he still ended up at his destination. He's a straight line ahead from the leftmost part of the panel. That spaceship discovered the playground planets of the universe. This was a really boring panel. Elroy mentions that he ducked when someone tried to hit him and hit someone else who got to stay home from school all week with a black eye. Why would a mere black eye get him that reward when he could still participate in school? That night, George doesn't look forward to going to his job tomorrow, and Jane suddenly reveals he's vice president. But George suddenly establishes that's because he's the only person in the plant other than Spacely. I know that's not true. So this is an alternate universe. And that's the fun of having a series that isn't held down by continuity. That goes so far as to make Rosie purple when she's supposed to be blue. That's what makes it different from the show. That it has stories taking place in other universes all the time without warning, and so it's got new ideas way more. I wouldn't expect a vice president of a factory to have to push a button all day. He starts to remember why he got his job. He went to the employment agency after marriage, and he was asked which job he wanted and flipped a coin. And one of the jobs was training to be a rocket jockey. He thought both ones sounded great, justifying why he flipped a coin. He fortunately justifies that he's too old to give up his pension and start over. I always wondered if the story would involve showing us what would change if little things didn't happen in the past. And now he sees someone with a time machine getting called crazy by Spacely because he doesn't believe him. George gets told that everyone scoffs at the idea of going backwards. That makes sense because they'd feel worse in the past, with less conveniences, and no food preservatives, meaning the food would be toxic for them, and the money would be no good in the past. But you'd think everybody would want to go back in time anyways, because then they could game the stock market. I guess he barely talks to anyone about it. And he tells him what date to send him back to, because he very conveniently remembered the exact date it was, when usually people don't. But in this universe, despite normally having the common sense of a moron, he's one of the rare people smart enough to be extremely good with remembering dates. He goes to the employment agency, somehow not being told that he looks older, and he says he'll take the rocket jockey job, confusing the guy who didn't tell anyone about it yet. He becomes a cargo driver, something that takes him to the four corners of the universe. It says this as if the universe is finite. After his first voyage, he comes home and sees his baby daughter for the first time. He complains that the trips are too long, but they keep making ships faster. Not that it matters for him, because the people he's working for want to conquer a new space beyond a planet X, which can't be the same one George first went to, because that one would have been way closer to Earth. George says to his wife that he'll be late getting home for Judy's graduation. He's told he missed 3 of Elroy's birthdays already. And somehow she still smiles at this, even if she looks nervous, because she's really optimistic. George loves seeing the places he has to drive to. This is so weird. Am I expected to believe he stayed back in time for the amount of time it takes for Judy to get born and graduate again? Then he'd come back to the present noticeably older and everyone would question it. But sometimes he loves his new job. He learns alien languages, because apparently they didn't have universal brain translators like Archie Sonic. Which is weird because a lot of aliens in the Jetsons talk in English anyways. He walks with heavy shoes on a tiny planet because his gravity sucks. Then when he goes home, not used to Earth's gravity, there's an overly depressing scene where most of his family doesn't recognize him and freaks out. Rosie checks his radiation count and ID tag with a convenient device to tell the kids who he is, and he thanks her. So he must have been told by his wife over the phone that Rosie got hired, and she must assume that's why he knows her name. His kids walk away not caring that he's there, and he looks horrified at Elroy knitting. Elroy says there's nothing wrong with it and that his mom taught him. It's a very useful hobby to have, so it's great for him. Especially if he hides it from his friends so he won't get bullied. But George just feels bad because if he was there for him, he would have never let him get talented at it. I hope things aren't like this anymore. Maybe they still are, because this wouldn't be out of place in King of the Hill. But you'd think that in the 2060s, the average father would be open-minded and just appreciate that he was being useful at a difficult hobby at a very early age. George thinks of Jane as his darling wife, and Jane does a kiss and run and says she's got a date with Alex, a rented robot that keeps her from getting bored. He can dance better than George, which fortunately justifies why she goes for him instead. Naturally, George realizes he was better off in the first timeline because he ruined his family life. Yeah, it defeated the whole point of getting married, but it looks like most of the time he had a fun, fulfilling life, way better than the one where he just sits there pressing a button. He got to be exposed to other cultures, seeing a lot of the universe. It's a lonely life, but that's the only reason it's not way better, because most of the hours of his days and most of his days are still more fun than bored button pushing, and his job taught him a lot. If he wasn't married, the job would be great. George says tomorrow he'll be up to the date where he met the Time Machine Man. So he goes to his old position in work, where the guy with the time machine is being chased out by Spacely, and he instantly goes back to his old timeline. It's too bad it cut right back to things being back to normal. I just have to assume the machine lets him go to another timeline, because he's already 17 years older. And I'd hate to think he proceeded to go back in time 17 years and relive his whole boring original life. Jane should have noticed he was 30 years older. Where's the de-aging ray? I have to assume that what he did instead was tell this guy to go back in time for him and talk the old him out of taking a rocket jockey job. So from his perspective, the world around him would revert to how he was used to. He looks relaxed as Elroy asks him to play ball with him, and Jane wants to go to the fly-in with him. Since he still yearns for the flyboy life, he ends the story with a painting of outer space above his workstation, while he's dressed like an astronaut. And Spacely's upset for no reason about his employee trying to enjoy his life. George must have paid a lot of money for these things. Then there's a page where George fixes the car and wants a nap from exhaustion. So he sleeps under his bed because he got too used to being under a car. So Jane lampshades that he's been doing too much work because he'd like a mattress more. In the next story, George sees a food-o-matic throwing plates with food on it towards Jane, because Rosie bumped the switch while cleaning behind it. She tells Rosie to clean up, and Rosie accidentally hits George's face with a mop, and Jane calls it reckless. I wonder if this will be a story about Rosie being clumsy and needing maintenance to fix it. George wonders why Elroy is still up, and gets told that it's because his favorite superhero show is on late. It's weird that Elroy says it's Superchamp's fault, as if Superchamp could be responsible for how late his show gets put on. Even if he was real, I doubt he'd have control over when it gets put on. George says his boss will stop by soon and he'll want it quiet so they could talk. So he trusts Rosie to put him to bed after other screw-ups. But of course she drops him in the wrong place instead of the bed, when you'd think she'd be able to see. This should actually mean she's got bad vision. But there's no reason she wouldn't have immediately told George about it, because these mishaps would be a lot more embarrassing than admitting she needs fixing once. Jane finally says she's getting worried about her, and George tests her by telling her to take Astro out, even though she's already proven there's a problem. We see Astro in the trash can outside because the dog tube was next to the other tube. George makes an excuse that's an easy mistake when it clearly wouldn't be, which would only make sense if he's so cheap he really doesn't want to pay to fix her as soon as possible when he could be saving up for something else. The doorbell rings, and Rosie opens the closet door instead. I just realized, since someone goes into the house via tube in the men's club story, it's inconsistent that there's stories where there's a front door for Rosie to get that someone has to wait outside. But it's better. Rosie looks at an empty spacesuit and somehow doesn't question its lack of a head when she's talking to it like it's a person. She'd have to be blind to not see the lack of a head, but she has to be able to see what's under it to think it's clothes and think it's a person at all. So this is confusing. Spacely opens the door on Rosie offended, and Rosie slams the door on him for it, blaming him for an obvious accident. George at least gets a chance to explain what's wrong, but Spacely makes it clear that he plans to punish him anyways for something that's not even his fault. At least it's surprisingly smart of someone in a comedy to decide to go home after this, because I thought he'd stay for dinner anyways and repeatedly put up with her. George somehow says that maybe she needs to rest, and presses a button for the maid's night out, even though she always made it obvious that she had a sight problem, which obviously this wouldn't cure. Everyone in this family is smarter than this. Rosie thanks him, and she blasts right through their space car's canopy with a rocket can. So in this universe they're called space cars, and the domes are called canopies for no reason. She would have heard what she did, even if she didn't see it. So she'd know there's a problem with her. Rosie says it's too late to cancel her night out, and George ends up putting a magnet on her rocket can from his space car to grab it. She looks confusingly unsympathetic, threatening to report him for this. She ends up at the robot doctor, and once again the concept of her getting a robot heart is brought up, with George being surprised at it, because this is a separate universe from the last time it was brought up. And again, I wonder why this wasn't the case already with other robots. So Rosie puts Elroy to bed with a kiss in the cheek. Luckily, he smiles at this, and she heads for the door when it rings. I wonder if she's gonna annoy Spacely by overwhelming him with affection. But thankfully it has a happy ending where he conveniently likes getting carried into the room, which is smart of him since he doesn't have to walk. And he even gives George a raise to get to his maid. In the next story, Elroy aims at Astro with a toy gun on a hoverboard that's making a turn into another room while he's casually looking at Jane, which implies he's able to automatically move and see. But it's still just begging to crash into someone because it couldn't stop on a dime without throwing Elroy off. So it'd still be considered too unsafe to sell. Jane complains about Astro having her fur coat on him for Elroy's game, and she takes it off, not wanting it damaged, as if there was any chance of that happening. Elroy apologizes, and eventually George and his family wait for his uncle to show up on the Lunar Express. Elroy's right beside his family and then runs over to a rocket ship, and somehow there's never any sign of his family going after him, even though they can hear. So he's somehow able to run into the rocket ship effortlessly. Elroy and Astro hear someone planning to go somewhere to bring back aliens for Zeus. Elroy decides to hide, and it took until George saw his uncle again to notice his son disappeared. He sees Elroy in the window of the rocket ship and decides to head for the control tower, wanting to radio the ship to turn back. The family gets told that the rocket's fast enough to get to the planet instantly, because magic, and the people talking to George don't want the rocket to come back right away. So Livingstone decides to lock Elroy and Astro on the ship for their safety. Elroy sees the rocket tubes fired to slow the ship to landing speed somehow, and escapes through one of them with Astro. He tries to lasso an alien and realizes it's a plant, and finds out Livingstone and his partner are running away from an alien magically shooting lightning. Livingstone casts aside some gear to run faster and plans to take off in the rocket, because apparently he gives up too easily when you'd think his gear would be for capturing aliens. Elroy trips on a canteen which starts leaking and he pours it, causing the alien to get distracted by its own reflection and shock itself, which it must have done because it thought it was seeing a threat. It's very convenient that Livingstone came back when he was planning to rocket away before. He must have only left the ship because he couldn't find Elroy, and despite showing no indication of caring about him before, as he didn't comfort him about ditching him, he still risked it to look for him, which could make sense for a selfish reason because he would get punished otherwise. He acknowledges Elroy is capturing it for his zoo, so it's frustrating that despite the good deed he did, the story ends with George punishing him, and on camera too. It's a pretty strange future that they think they can get away with that on camera, because one of the reasons this punishment was outlawed was that it decreases the amount of gray matter in the brain, and scientists would have discovered that long before Jetsons technology. But of course, it's still good writing to have a character get punished on screen for worrying his parents or something. Then there's a page where Judy's taking care of her hair for a date with a new exchange student, only to come home hours later with her hair ruined. She's smart enough to say she'll never work so hard on her hair for him again because she had to ride around on a hover carpet all night. You'd think everyone would have these, not just him for a dated joke. Aside from the fact that they're blatantly unsafe with nothing to keep someone strapped onto them, he's not being safe because he's not holding onto it, and there's no indication of how he's controlling it. So it has to be with his mind. And then Jane tells someone at a store to put a turkey in her trailer, and she drives away with the turkey in a smaller second space car behind hers that's being roasted by the rocket fire in front of it. So dinner's ready by the time she gets home, which is clever of her as she came up with it. The first story is George meets someone with time travel technology, and going back in time to see what his life would be like if he took a job as an interplanetary cargo driver. He thinks he's going to awesome places, and it's culturally enriching for him, but it ruins his family life because the trips are so long that he's an absentee parent and husband. So he undoes it. But I hate that it's off screen, so I just have to assume he sent that guy back in time to undo it for him, to send things back to normal for him instantly from his perspective. Nobody ever questions that he's 17 years older when he goes back to the past. It has to be that he de-aged as well, but that should have been explained. The beginning ended up being a waste of time because we don't get to see why it wouldn't be worth it if any of those other things never happened. You'd think robots would be cargo drivers, because they won't get to have family lives that could be ruined. Then there's a story where Rosie's got a vision problem making her constantly screw up, and somehow doesn't even notice that she drove through the air dome of George's space car. And the whole time it's confusing that she didn't immediately warn George that she needs fixing so she'd never mess up again. Meanwhile, in an episode of the show, she eventually did figure out she needed fixing. There's also a story where Elroy goes on a rocket ship with an interplanetary traveler without his parents noticing he left them, even though he talked right before heading for exactly the thing he commented on. And he uses his brain to help the guy shock an alien so he could capture it.